Good morning. Development is about changing the use, production, and distribution of resources. Disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management is about safeguarding the achievements of development. So let's not kid ourselves. When we talk about incorporating DRR into the development process, this is a very complicated system with people who will be opposing it, and we need to develop an analysis tool to study not only the technical aspects, but also the dynamics of change, who opposes it, what are the modes of opposing it and pushing it forward, and what are the modes of lobbying for it. And this presentation is about such a tool. Sorry, it's not working. Is that part of the 15 minutes? So anyway, as an application to the tool that I'm proposing, I want to first review the progress of the Arab states in implementing the Hyogo framework of action and in effecting DRR change. As the slide shows, if I take the average of the grades of the Arab states under all priority areas, we see that under all areas the grade is 3 or below, meaning institutional commitment with no substantial or comprehensive achievements. If we ask why, maybe the first reason that comes to mind is that because interventions have been segregated under different priority areas without them being linked with an overall overarching umbrella, as indeed is the spirit of the HFA. Another reason might be that not enough linkages exist with attempts to implement the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. And if we look more in detail about the challenges in the implementation of the MDGs as published in the latest UNESCO report, and the priority areas where challenges exist in the implementation of the MDGs, we see parallels with the challenges that exist in the implementation or attempts to implement the HFA. So for example, we see main challenges in food security, poverty reduction, and unemployment from a development perspective. From a DRR perspective, we see that there is very little, if any, efforts made to reduce the physical and, the economic and social factors that contribute to disaster vulnerability. So instead of DRR and development complementing each other, we have a situation where disaster risk is not reducing, or disaster risk management efforts are not reducing the economic and social factors that contribute to disaster vulnerability, and this in turn will increase food insecurity, is increasing poverty, is increasing unemployment, and so on. On the other hand, adaptation to climate change, which is identified as a major issue from a development perspective, is also a major issue from a DRR perspective, where almost all national platforms do not have representation from the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, which, as we all know, is one of the major sectors that are affected by climate change. And obviously, from a from a development perspective, there are many gender challenges, and these exist as well from a DRR perspective. For example, very few of the countries have carried out any gender disaggregated vulnerability, capacity, and needs assessment. Obviously, these challenges are better understood if we divide the states according to the different development stages that they are at. So, for example, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries would have different challenges than the least developed Arab states and then other states. Attempts to implement the HFA take place against a much broader background. If we look at the HFA, which started in 2007, this coincided with the global food crisis, which took place in 2007. Then we had the fuel crisis culminating or peaking in 2008, the financial crisis in 2008, and the global recession, which is still perhaps unfolding. So these are international crises that have definitely affected the region, and they have affected the region in each country in different ways. We also have inter-regional conflicts. We have sort of, we can call them maybe civil wars or civil conflicts in Iraq, Libya, Syria, Sudan, and Yemen. We have occupation in Palestine, and we have non-state players in Lebanon which are stronger than the state. All this complicates the situation further. It accentuates factors that work against disaster risk reduction, such as weak governance, the right to information, gender-sensitive services, public administration performance, and so on. So basically, when it comes to assessing the progress that has been achieved in the HFA, when it comes to assessing attempts to effect DRR change, we need to look at a much broader picture than simply looking at the HFA priorities or than simply looking at only the MDG Millennium Goals. In addition, basically, to carrying out the technical analysis of seeing how the main physical, social, economic, natural, and institutional factors interact and accumulate to increase disaster vulnerability, and how these in turn may affect, increase or decrease the main disaster risk drivers, which are poverty, environmental degradation, weak governance, and unchecked urban expansion, so that we want to do this analysis on one dimension, this technical analysis, if you want, whether qualitative or quantitatively, but we also want to do another kind of analysis, which is the interaction between the governance and the drivers for change. And this is the tool that is being proposed here. It is a hybrid tool. It takes into account two main initiatives internationally. One is the risk governance framework, which has been developed by the International Risk Governance Council. And the other one is the political economy drivers for change analysis tool, which was originally put forward by the UK DFID department. And we brought these two together to analyze some of the salient challenges affecting DRR change in the region, but this can be applied everywhere. So for example, if we first look at the education sector, and the problem there is that most efforts focus solely at evacuation drills and response plan without sufficient efforts focusing at prevention or at corrective risk management to reduce existing levels of risk. Then we try to do that by looking at what we call the pre-assessment risk governance stage, where at the pre-assessment stage, which must ideally frame the risk problem and put forward solutions to it. So there we must ask the question, did anyone propose to do a national school safety program? If this was proposed, who are the people who lobbied for it? Who are the people that perhaps opposed it? And this must be asked not only from a technical, as I said, perspective, but also from a drivers of change perspective. Similarly, if we look at another main challenge in the region, which is carrying out gender disaggregated vulnerability, capacity, and needs assessment, we need to look at that from another risk governance stage, which is what we call the technical and societal assessment stage, where basically risk is assessed not only from a technical perspective, but also from a societal perspective. And being assessed from a societal perspective means that there is a two-way communication process between governments and communities, where the main concerns of communities are taken into account, and they are not looked at only as people who must receive the message. So from this perspective, we must ask the question, why was a gender disaggregated capacity, vulnerability, and need assessment carried out or not carried out? Was it put forward? Were there gatekeepers who were opposed to it? And so on. And basically, why is this, as is often the case, and as is often the main challenge, why is the main initiatives for capacity building and raising awareness not being grounded on, not being informed by a gender disaggregated capacity, needs, and vulnerability assessment? Then if we look at another problem which is common in the region, which is the issue of very high levels of risk in slums or in unchecked urban areas, where in the region we have in some states urban ratios exceed 85%, slum to urban ratios exceed 50%. So we need to ask the question, why is it that most attempts for DRR are focusing on response? Why is it that very few attempts of DRR are focusing on prevention, which would prevent future risks? But more importantly, why is it that very few attempts for DRR interventions are focusing on reducing the very high levels of existing risk? So why is it that there are very few attempts to embark on what we call corrective risk management strategies? And this brings us to look at it from a different perspective, which is the risk evaluation stage within the risk governance framework. Who sets levels for tolerable and unacceptable risk? Who says that such risks in very high unchecked urban settlements and slums are acceptable? And who are the people who would oppose reducing such risk or oppose the reduction of such risk being discussed in the decision-making framework? And how do we form lobbies and how do we form coalitions to push forward for this agenda? Similarly, as I mentioned before, there are many interregional conflicts in the region. So if we want to look at attempts to integrate initiatives for disaster risk reduction with initiatives for conflict resolution, and integrate both with initiatives for development, because really the interface is disaster risk reduction, development, and conflict interface, not only disaster conflict interface. So here again, we need to see how do we best form coalitions to push this combined agenda forward. And basically, what I'm trying to say as a conclusion to this talk is that it's not sufficient to do the technical analysis, which looks at from a technical perspective, whether qualitative or quantitative, at the physical, economic, social, institutional, and natural factors that increase vulnerability, and how these interact with the main disaster risk drivers of poverty, unchecked urban expansion, governance, and environmental degradation, but often to understand the challenges that are inherent in the process and to push forward attempts to effect change and to effect development and DRR change. We must also look at another dimension of the process, which is from a drivers for change analysis tools, which takes into account as well the risk governance challenges. And thank you very much. If there are any questions, yes.
I'm sorry I came at the fag end of your talk, but from what I heard, the keywords, the conflict and looking at the conflict interface and disasters. I am from a cultural heritage agency, ECROM, and we have been doing training for something like this, like conflict and how conflict adds to the disaster risk. And it's a kind of an ongoing risk management, especially with view to cultural heritage. And in Lebanon and other places, something like this kind of a thing is needed. But do you take heritage into your, like if you are thinking of everything? Because a part of the problem is also about identity and, other things. So are you factoring that part in your...
Yes, you are right, because actually, and it's the same conclusion. It's the same conclusion that was reached when reviewing the MDG progress,
yes.
Which the UNESCO concluded by saying it is not possible to do any further improvements by focusing solely on individual social, economic, or environmental dimensions, but a broader approach is required, which would focus also on cultural and political dimensions for the development perspective. And similarly, from a DRR perspective, it's no longer sufficient to push change forward, to focus at the different HFA areas, ignoring the risk governance and political and cultural perspective, if you want. Yes.
Just to add to this discussion, I think the thing that has frustrated me in this global platform is that last year there was a talk about fragile states and disasters in fragile states. And this year, that seems to be completely wiped off the agenda. And, something like what you're saying should also go on to the post-HFA, because this is increasing because of the disparities that we are creating, or the horizontal inequalities that we are creating now.